Hello, hello. I am somehow back in some form or another. Life has been a little bit chaotic recently. However, I've had a project stewing in the back of my brain for a few months now, and I figured I might give it a shot just to see if it would go anywhere. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Maybe this will literally just be like a single episode in the bunch of things that I have done. Maybe it'll be more, but that is actually kind of up to you guys and whether or not you want to contribute to it. Now, the project I've had in mind, my brain has titled it Never Blessed. A big part of my platform, we have talked about religious trauma and manipulative wellness. I'm an ex-Seventh-day Adventist. I grew up in like a little bit of like a doomsday culture. I grew up thinking the government was coming for us. A lot of stuff that was just very manipulative, but it was sold as wellness. So something that has become important to me, and a little bit of like a hyper-focused interest, is the topic of manipulative wellness, identifying it, recovering from it. And I was kind of thinking possibly Never Blessed could be a resource to help people both identify, pre-protect, be preventative, or just for recovery's sake, and validity if you've been through something like that yourself and hearing stories from other people. So what I'm doing essentially is taking contributions from viewers where I ask you, first of all, what was the wellness or blessing that you were promised? Number two, what actually happened as you tried to live up to that pursuit of the wellness? What impact did it actually have on your life versus for example, you could say it's tithing, maybe it was an MLM, things like that. And lastly, I'm looking for, how did you recover? What perspectives, what tools did you find over time to help you transition away from that manipulative wellness? And what does that look like for you today? So I've had 2 contributions so far, one a little bit shorter from the Discord server, and the other was sent to my email. There's a few places you can submit, but my email preferably, rosiequartzofficial@gmail.com, or we have the House of Quartz Discord server, which has the Quartzcast discussion area. And the first submission was sent in to me by Pete, who says, "Hi, Rosie. My name is Pete. Hi, Pete. And I've been following you for a while on Instagram. Just want to start by saying how freeing and relatable your content is. Thank you for doing all that you do. It's very affirming. And now to the good bits." Good bits. I'm so sorry. A big basis of my platform is a little bit more on the spicy side. So just a little bit of a heads up there for those of you who are newer to my content. I am a side quest giver. I give side quests for XP. All right, and Pete goes on to say, "I was raised in the Baptist to mega church evangelical pipeline." That's a very specific pipeline. And Baptist in particular, like I was raised Seventh-day Adventist, and that background kind of comes from like Baptist Methodist. There was a Seventh-day type of, I believe it was Baptist back in the day, and that's where we've got the subsidiary of all this. Like you go from like that into William Miller's whole doomsday thing in the 1800s, then it's like Adventism, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormonism, FLDS. I was so ingrained that I decided to dedicate my life to becoming a pastor. My condolences. I don't know about anybody else out there who might be watching that who grew up thinking that God was going to call them to some kind of ministry. And because I grew up Adventist, and Adventism has a prophetess, I grew up so worried that God was going to like give me the gift of prophecy and I'd have to dedicate the rest of my life to that, or God would call me to be a pastor's wife. The way that I was so worried about this outcome for my life, I was like, dear God, please no, please no, please no. Or even worse, a missionary's wife. And I was like, absolutely not. The way I was just like, you know what? I feel like I should have some consent, some say in all of this. But of course, when you're raised in those environments, you don't really get consent. You have yes or punishment, which is not how consent works. The story of Jonah being a very good example of that. I do not want to go over here, God. Too bad. You go or wail. So there's not exactly any kind of reversible consent when you work for that type of deity. Wanted to dedicate life to becoming a pastor, married young, samesies, lost virginity on the wedding night. So awkward. So lost virginity on my wedding night. So awkward. And then became a pastor in the mega church I grew up in. Oh wow, you actually just became a legacy in that community. Oh boy. Okay, so we've got a little bit of the backstory where you're coming from, and now to the blessing I was promised. Literally the best life possible. I was told that, much like Jesus himself, there was one way to do this. One way to have your life work out just the way you wanted it to do. And that was Jesus, marriage, and avoidance of the ever elusive and always changing idea of sin. This is a very familiar thing that I was raised with as well. And what I came to know over time is that type of box, being put into a box where they're like, if you want to have all of this blessing, you have to live exactly this one way. That is called high demand over self. And high demand over self behaviors. Some people are a little bit more vulnerable to that than others, but it can have a confirmation bias to it because it can give you a sense of routine. So for people who are struggling with mental health, executive functioning, they can come into a high demand over self church and feel like it gave their life structure. And they're like, oh my goodness, like, yeah, I got right with God and my life came together. And it's really just like, bitch, you just needed a routine. I remember specifically asking throughout my life, okay, so we genuinely believe that anything outside of this way is bad. And time again, I was told yes. And I think that's the case with many high demand over self organizations, is that you have your in-group versus the out-group, and anything outside of the in-group is inherently incorrect. It has to be in order to maintain your loyalty to the in-group, and that's how they make sure that they get your money, your time, your volunteer work. So I continued on, had children, had bad intimate moments. Listen. Oh, so much of this already, like, it resonates with me because, like, I have been married before. I married another pastor's kid, and I honestly, not just because, like, I have a little bit of a side quest platform over here, something I have come to learn over time that is very important is that there's a neuroticism that's built around schmexy times within these types of organizations and within the in-group, is that they take things, including like your diet, how you dress, how you have intimate times with your partner, and they build a neuroticism around it that often results in like your intimate life actually being quite terrible, quite awful. Especially, like, they'll tell you that you have to save yourself for marriage. You'll become one with your partner in Jesus, which is weird because, like, suddenly somehow you're having like a spiritual threesome with Jesus there, which I always found weird. I from childhood onward, anytime like Christian marriage was described, I remember being just so innately, distinctly uncomfy because I'm like, this is my intimate time and I feel like you shouldn't be here. However, like, for a lot of people who bought into the idea that schmex before marriage would automatically equal great intimate time, and they got right up to it only to be like, that sucked. I didn't know what I was doing. They didn't know what they were doing. I do not feel any closer to them. I feel awkward, maybe a little bit traumatized. I feel violated. I feel embarrassed, and it builds like a sense of shame around it. And for a lot of people in those situations, it never improved. My wife at the time, bless her heart, wouldn't even let me on her because of how much the church had fucked us up. And that's another thing, is that if you were raised your entire life to believe that your body is a trap for men, is a stumbling block, and is inherently some kind of form of your body's inherently bad, and then you get in a relationship with a man, you marry him, you've been married in Christ, and then you're supposed to like just let him go places around your body, and you're like, but that's the bad place. Like, you're just like you're looking at like your secret tunnel, God's secret pocket of shame down there, and you're like, you can't go there. You're just suddenly supposed to give people access to it, and that can be so very awful. It can be a truly awful and uncomfortable experience for people because they're all of a sudden supposed to be comfortable with something they're told no one should go there. We were married for 13 years and got to do the downstairs maybe 3 times. Oh my God, that's actually tragic. Think of all of the Greek tragedies out there, and I think this is up there with some of the greatest Greek tragedies. But unfortunately, I'm not surprised. I mean, it's not uncommon for stuff like this to go on for well over a decade. The shame was fucking horrendous. I became a pastor, and even though I was certainly conservative at the time, I was viewed as the progressive one. Well, that explains you've strayed. You have strayed from the path. You allowed the devil to coerce you from the straight and narrow over time. And I suppose I was for that place because I decided to go to church leadership to determine a stance or approach to the LGBTQIA plus folks. In my mind, we were all good people. We'd be inclusive, right? You would think so. You would think so, wouldn't you? Now, the organization I grew up with, they are staunchly anti-LGBTQ there's no room for it. It's kind of where conversion therapy originated from. Long story short, that conversation went so terribly. Hundreds, bordering on thousands, left the church because I even had the conversation. Holy shit, when you say megachurch, you were not kidding. I received death threats. I could not walk the campus of my church anymore, and so completely disillusioned, I left. And that's something I've talked about on my Twitch streams before, is when people talk about like their friends or family being in these organizations, how do you talk them out of it? How do you get them out of it? And what I had to say, at least in my experience, is that I had to become disillusioned with it. Like, you couldn't argue me out of it. You couldn't common sense verbally walk me through it. You couldn't bring me resources because there's an illogical dedication and loyalty to the concept of serving this deity with your life. So you cannot be logicked out of that because it's inherently illogical at a baseline. So it's typically an experience of disillusionment where you realize what you've dedicated yourself to. Like, for example, being like, we're all good people. We should support everyone. That means being inclusive. Jesus said to love everybody, only to get like a massive smackdown of actually, Jesus may love everybody, but we don't. Actually, no, that's nice for Jesus, but actually Jesus hates these people. So no. I'd go from there to work for an inclusive spiritual center called the Center for Action and Contemplation. That's kind of a little bit of a sus name for a business, but yeah, given it's an inclusive spiritual center, maybe you've heard of it. I thought it would be better, and in many ways it was, but still had the same flavor. No, I can tell you right now, Center for Action and Contemplation, where no, it's the contemplation part for me. That's one of the red flags of those places that have a base of you can cerebral your way out of sin kind of thing. I still had the same we know the best way to do this vibe, and still felt out of alignment. Yeah, because the basis of a lot of this stuff is you have to control your thoughts, your feelings. Sin is you not controlling your heart. Sin is you not controlling your thoughts. And therefore, they'll be like action and contemplation because they are giving you this illusion of disciplining yourself away from sin, when really it's just reinforcing the high demand over self. Which brings me back to something that I felt has been sort of a barometer for my life, which is schmex. My wife and I divorced 6 years ago. Killed it, by the way. We split so well and are such good friends now. I love that. Love that for you guys very much. And as soon as we did, I was determined to get out there and have good times. A common story amongst us repressed folks. And so I did. And it was freeing and beautiful, and I just wanted more. I am on the very same page about that. There is something so amazing and freeing about having great physical intimacy for once in your life, and you're just like, the serotonin hits. If you're with like a thoughtful, considerate partner, like, oh my goodness, it hits different. It hits so good. Even longer story short, explored E&M, or ethical non-monogamy, and decided to start doing polyamory with intention. I read the books, did the work, and am so grateful for it. And it also opened my world up to exploring kink and BD connections without shame. Fucking love that for you. Fast forward to today, and I'm working on becoming a professional dom. And my reasons for that have been so interesting. Because sure, it's been fun doming and subbing. Yay for switching. Shout out to our switches out here. But mostly it's been incredible seeing how so many others need that space, have craved that space, and never had a safe space to explore it. Listen, the way that I, as somebody who worked in online professional dom space for a couple of years, I can very much attest to how much of a positive impact it can make for people if you are doing intentional space for them to explore things consensually and safely as possible. It can do so much good for somebody's sense of self and their understanding of their own, like what gives them pleasure and what brings them serotonin, what feels fulfilling for them. And it's so very cool to be a part of that process for somebody. I've had the privilege of being part of that for a few people over the past couple years, and that's something that I'm going to carry with me for the rest of my life. And I can't believe I have had the opportunity to do that. I began having so many folks say, you should really charge for this. So now I am, because I love showing people what could be, love freeing them from the shame we grew up with, showing them that life is more than that. Now, and the thing is about like guilt and shame is that guilt and shame are often reinforcers. They're not active deterrents. That's a little bit of like a confirmation bias, that if you punish somebody, you'll deter them from it, when chances are you're actually reinforcing something entirely different. So often with guilt and shame, instead of helping us avoid things that are unhealthy for us, guilt and shame often drive us into some really maladaptive cycles that are not great for our sense of self, not great for our self-esteem, and not great for building a genuine understanding of self and connection to others. I have no idea if I answered your second two questions. I would say yes, but I'll end with this. I was taught there was one way to be good, but the more people I meet, the more I see that there are so many ways to be good. And we need that. We need to be good in different ways, and I found one of them, so have you. Thank you for letting me blabber on, and if you want better, more specific info, here for it, ask away. And so this is Sagro Limbo on Instagram. Thank you so very much for the submission here. I think that actually very well covered something that I've been trying to drive for in this project. And I love that, like, as as a spice merchant, as a side quest giver, I love that this went straight for the whole, like, I was having awful physical intimacy. This wasn't great. Would love to see that type of vulnerability, because, like, especially like for so many people, that's one of the things where shame can be so intense and you don't talk about it. And yeah, no, I love that that was very much like, no, we were having bad physical intimacy. This is why, and here's my progress since, and I'm now having much better intimacy, and as a result, I'm now actually serving other people in a way that is uplifting to them and fulfilling for me, and we absolutely do love to see it. There's, like, I could tell you guys so many horror stories about what I was raised with in regards to schmex, physical intimacy, the beliefs surrounding that. It could be anything from you have to be married, man and woman under God, to don't do certain specific positions or else demons in all your holes, which quite frankly, I can say through a series of trial and error scientific process, I can tell you, unfortunately, that is not the case. Certain positions, unfortunately, will not bring demons, and you will have a very anticlimactic time if you were expecting demons to come and help out in that scenario. And actually, I think Pete is one of like a few different pastors / former pastors who have found me over the past couple of years, and I love hearing from former church leadership. I really do, because one of my own personal like little conspiracy theories is that a lot of the people at the top, the head of the church, know it's a grift, like they know what they're doing, they don't really believe in it. But then you've got the like elders, deacons, people in between who think that they're actually doing a real ministry, and then coming up against like how the like trying to make real change, like what was described in the story. Let's be inclusive to the LGBTQ plus that are around us, and instead got smacked down by leadership and the congregation. Like it's one of those things where you just get like smacked upside the head, and you're like, I thought I was doing a real genuine ministry here. I thought I was doing what Jesus called us to do, only to have everybody be like, no. And one of the reasons you won't see a lot of Christian churches be LGBTQ plus affirming is specifically because it goes back to the high demand over self. They're selling you the idea that everything has to be exactly one way. And one version of that is like schmexuality and gender. You cannot have a high demand over self structure if you allow for there to be multiple schmexualities and genders and things like that. Like the identification, it has to be man, woman, married under God. That is the high demand of self. You cannot acknowledge anything else, or you detract from the grift that you are selling people. It has to be very specific. And so if you try to bring in a ministry where, like, let's say you as a church member or in church leadership, you're like, I believe that Jesus meant for us to be inclusive, and so let's do a ministry for LGBTQIA that's affirming. You are running directly contrary to the high demand over self program that they're trying to use on the congregation. So you are typically going to hit a wall, because then people are not as likely to buy in to the blessing that's being sold. So in this case, the blessing is you are man, you are woman, together, bear children under God, equal blessing. They try to make it like a very like simple mathematical equation. Man, woman, marry, equal blessing under God. Very simple. You cannot detract from that in any way, or they will kind of like freak out on you, because they want the money, they want the tithe, they want the congregation loyalty, they want people to be focused on the simple equation rather than taking in the complexity that is the general human experience. And our second contribution for today, which was left in the Quartz Cast discussion area, is from She Hath No Name, which is one of my Twitch stream regulars. So if you are hanging out with me in one of my Twitch streams, you are very likely to come across them. And what they said was, I began living half of my time at my dad and stepmom's when I was 12 to 14. During this time, my stepmom slowly separated me from my family and the few friends I had, while promising me a more happy, healthy, and fulfilled life. Well, there's a first red flag for sure, is when those types of people start separating you from your usual support network. They make you more reliant, and especially like at that age when your brain is at like that level of development, it's very easy to make you dependent on them. I came to see that her many promises and claims are nothing but lies and self-grandizing. When the pressure she put on me and the mistreatment became too much, leading to several attempts on my own life. And I love, because part of my platform is that we do talk about some very hard subject matter, and take it on right off the bat. Mental health is definitely something very important to me, because Kermit a Slewer slide is something that type of ideation was something that was very familiar to me from a very, very young age, unfortunately. Like, we're talking as young as 5. So to me, this isn't even remotely surprising if you are being isolated and you also had somebody who had a grandiose sense of self. Like, there's certain types of people where they have to make themselves a bigger figurehead in your life than they actually are. And unfortunately, this is something I've dealt with more recently than I would like to admit. But unfortunately, this was something I dealt with in a previous relationship where the person decided that they needed to be a figurehead in our financial situation that they were, because guys get so attached to that idea of being a provider. and they tell you that you need them for security, that they do this, that, and the other for you, but that completely overrides your contributions that you've made. And in that situation, like, I was paying in equally to our bills and paying for so many different things and special things for them, only to not get in return. But they had they had dedicated so much of their brain cells to this idea that they were a provider, and that is kind of like the unfortunate part of it for people who've been through like abusive situations, people who have undergone that experience of having, like, if you're a kid, you're reliant on this person who is clearly like out to lunch and is using you to prop up their own ego. So there's like an extra, like, experiencing something like that as an adult is pretty sucky, but when you're a kid, it can be so very destabilizing to have an adult use you as a prop for their own ego. I started the long road to healing when she found out about my attempts and started trying to push me into another attempt. Jesus Christ. You know, some people are literally on a whole other level of manipulation. And I think one of like the hardest parts about it is having to come to terms with the fact that like somebody who claims to care, or like they literally have a legal onus of care over you, can do that sort of thing, can actually cross those lines, and you have to comprehend how they have no empathy, and that can be super difficult. It was then that I saw what she wanted was to make me become just like her, but once I tried to something she would never do, I became a failure in her eyes and not worthy to live. Her words showed me that my pain and self-loathing wasn't something that was wrong with me. That's some really great self-awareness. Some absolutely fantastic self-awareness. There was like a quote I became aware of very recently. I just scrolled into it, and it was like, I refuse to take on the shame and blame of this person's behavior. I am going to move on with my life, and the only question I'll ask is what could possibly be so broken in them that they could behave that kind of way. And for somebody to treat you that way, unfortunately, there is still a lot of stigma in regards to suicidal ideation, and it can become something where, like, it's why I say in my content, your worth is not your productivity, because so many times mental health is treated as something where you're just not trying hard enough, you're lazy, you're not doing a good enough job taking care of yourself, and it's like, it's treated as this thing where it's a choice. You're living in so much pain because you're choosing to, which it really comes back to the ego of the person, because that's what they're doing to themselves. And it actually ties into the high demand over self we talked about earlier, where you are literally being that hard on yourself. You think your worth is how much you've dedicated to this ideology. And for a lot of people, they're like, well, I'm doing fine and I'm doing great because I choose to. And that becomes the foundation of their identity, which can backfire so badly. If you're the type of person to think that you're doing well solely on the premise of your work, then you are going to be so taken for a ride if you suddenly become disabled. If there's like something happens in your life, like, because I did disability care for a while, and the ones who had the hardest time with it were usually men between the ages of like 30 to 55 who'd been in an accident and now suddenly needed my help to do basic human functions. They had such a very hard time with it, and that's the thing, is like, we're all temporarily abled. But back to the story. Her words show me that my pain and self-loathing wasn't something that was wrong with me, but something caused by her. And I refused to die because someone else told me to. I love that. I love the malicious non-compliance of like, no, I don't care what you tell me to do. I'm not going to do that. I left 13 days later and never looked back. In a very real way, my life was saved by spite. You know what, sometimes though, that really is what carries you through. Because I was looking for like, what were you promised? What was the actual result? And then a tool that helped you come through. And spite, I have to say, I am at a baseline. There are moments I will not go out of my way. I will not go out of my way to somebody. However, if life happens to just ironically bring things together, I will be delightfully and satisfactorily petty. However, I can certainly understand the whole survival by spite thing. I think spite is a very powerful motivator, especially if somebody was trying to make you reliant on them, or they were telling you all of this negative stuff about yourself. I have a prior history in my relationships, once again more recent than I would I would have liked, but I have experienced, unfortunately, DA in relationships, and one of the things that helped me through those experiences the most is spite. I was not going to give up, and I was not going to accept the things that he would tell me about myself out of sheer spite. And spite can be something that like is an ego defense. Ego defenses, they can be maladaptive or they can be helpful. So they're a tool that our brain has to help keep our sense of self intact. And I highly recommend living spitefully. If you've gone through certain types of circumstances, they do not want to see you healthy or happy, especially if you were some kind of supply to them. Like as we saw in this story, you were a type of supply to the stepmother. They're using you in some way. And when you got out, like when they saw you having these issues with your mental health, they perceive their supply as being compromised and they punish you for it. And that's something I've experienced as well. Like as I start like leaving relationships that were not very safe, like you start setting boundaries, you start making steps to move away, and you will experience punishments in return, specifically because like they think they're owed access to you, or they're resentful of the loss of supply. And they can almost treat you as if you were something they were addicted to. You were feeding something. You're feeding something for them, and they'll become resentful, lash out, do things to punish you for the removal of their supply. So I just want to say thank you to both Pete and She Hath No Name for today's submissions. I want to keep these episodes hopefully within like a reasonable amount of time. And like I said, really, if we continue doing these discussion episodes for Never Blessed, that'll depend on you guys. And maybe listening in, you found something relatable that you would like to share yourself. Like I said, you can submit those things to me, and if you are sending in submissions, they're relevant, we'll continue doing these. And I want to say a huge thank you to some of my top supporters recently who have been just showing up for me on a whole other level during a very difficult and stressful period of my life at the moment, as I am currently like life in transition, moving on to some bigger, better things I've been excited for such a very long time. The process of getting there, logistical nightmare, but we're working it out. So I want to say a huge thank you to Maestro Spooks, Kill a Maverick, let's see, we've also got Quinmis as well. There are a few others we're going to put over here. You guys, thank you so very much. We're also going to start having more liminal space content over on TikTok. So if you've liked the cosplays into self-care reminders and affirmation, more of that is going to be going up on TikTok, with extended versions being put up on Patreon. Now that I have some more access to my life, to my job, to my work as a content creator due to the current circumstances, it's kind of like a bittersweet set of circumstances happening in my life right now. We can actually focus back on those things. So thank you to the House of Quartz community. You guys have been so uplifting, so affirming to me, and hopefully maybe in this episode you heard some things that were validating or helpful, new to you, whatever else, and you can come back to this resource later, send it on to somebody else you might think is helpful, all of that good stuff. And of course, remember, do good things for yourself that make your brain go brrr, follow the serotonin, and of course, hydrate, do all that good stuff, and maybe we'll see you on a next episode of one of these. Mwah.